The crystal chandeliers of the orchid ballroom didn't just illuminate the room. They magnified every lie. They cast a harsh, unforgiving light on Seraphina Vale's perfectly curated smile, a smile that felt as fragile as the champagne flute in her hand. Her husband, Dominic Wrenford, stood a few feet away, a titan of industry encased in a bespoke tuxedo, his laughter booming across the marble floors. But he wasn't laughing with her. He was laughing with Sloan Whitmore, whose scarlet dress was a slash of defiance against the ballroom's genteel decor. Seraphina felt a familiar, cold dread coiling in her stomach, a dread that had nothing to do with the life growing inside her, and everything to do with the man who put it there. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. If emotional stories speak to you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss this one. Let's dive into it. The air in the orchid ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was the annual Wrenford Enterprises Philanthropy Gala, the glittering pinnacle of the city's social calendar. For Seraphina, it was the yearly performance review of her role as Mrs. Dominic Wrenford. She had to be elegant, attentive, and above all, invisible in her radiance. Tonight, however, invisibility was not an option. Her hand rested instinctively on the gentle swell of her belly, a 5-month secret she had been cherishing like a hidden pearl. It was the only thing that felt real in her gilded cage. She had planned to tell Dominic tonight, to finally see a flicker of the man she had married, not the cold monolith he had become. Dominic's voice, a low rumble of amusement, cut through the polite chatter. He was with Sloan, his hand resting on the small of her back with an intimacy that was a public declaration. Sloan, his star VP of acquisitions, was sharp, ambitious, and everything Seraphina was not. Her eyes, the color of expensive whiskey, met Seraphina's across the room, and they held a glint of undisguised triumph. Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. This was different. This wasn't the usual boardroom flirtation or the late-night meetings. This was a coronation. Sloan was being crowned, and Seraphina was the relic being deposed. Summoning a courage she didn't know she possessed, she walked towards them. Her heels clicked a funereal rhythm on the polished floor. The conversations around them didn't stop, but they lowered, a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that signaled impending drama. Dominic, Seraphina's voice was softer than she intended, a fragile bird in a storm. May I have a word with you? Dominic turned, his smile tightening. It was the smile he used on hostile board members, not his wife. Seraphina, can't you see I'm busy? It's important, she insisted, her gaze flicking to Sloane's proprietary smirk. Sloan leaned in, her red lips close to Dominic's ear. Don't let her make a scene, darling. It's so unbecoming. The word darling was a perfectly aimed dart. It hit Seraphina with physical force. I would like to speak to my husband, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. Alone. Dominic's face darkened. The power imbalance in their marriage was a chasm, and she had just dared to shout across it. Whatever you have to say, you can say right here. It was a test, a public execution of her dignity. Seraphina looked at the faces around them, a gallery of feigned indifference. They were sharks smelling blood. She took a deep breath, the scent of lilies suddenly cloying. Fine, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't how she'd imagined it. Not in a million years. "I'm pregnant, Dominic." The words hung in the air, suddenly silencing the nearby whispers. Sloan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Dominic's face went blank, a mask of cold fury replacing his irritation. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "We're having a baby," she repeated, a desperate plea in her eyes. "Please, see me. Remember us." Sloan let out a small theatrical gasp. "Oh, Dominic, is this her latest attempt to trap you? How predictable. Trap me." Dominic's gaze was glacial. He looked at Seraphina's belly, not with wonder, but with revulsion, as if she were carrying a disease. "You think a child will fix this? You think it absolves you?" "Absolves me of what?" Seraphina's confusion was genuine. "What have I done but love you?" "You've become a weight, Seraphina," he hissed, stepping closer, his towering frame casting her in shadow. "A beautiful, expensive weight I can no longer afford to carry." The cruelty was so profound, it left her breathless. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. She saw the flash of satisfaction in Sloan's. "Don't you dare cry," Dominic commanded. "Don't you dare play the victim here." And then, with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been told no, who believed the world was his to command and everyone in it a subject, he raised his hand. The sound of the slap was a gunshot in the cathedral of wealth. It wasn't a brutal fist-swinging blow, but something far more insidious. It was a sharp, stinging crack of palm against cheek, an act of utter humiliation designed to shatter, not just injure. The force of it snapped Seraphina's head to the side. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The music seemed to stutter and die. Time slowed. Seraphina felt the imprint of his fingers on her skin, a brand of shame that burned hotter than any physical pain. The chandeliers seemed to sway. Her first thought wasn't for herself. It was for the tiny, fragile life inside her. A wave of terror, fierce and maternal, washed over her. She lifted her head, her cheek blazing red, but her eyes were clear. The tears were gone, replaced by a terrifying, desolate calm. She looked at Dominic, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man she loved, the man she had sacrificed her own ambitions and identity for, was gone. In his place stood this monster, his face contorted in a mask of rage. She didn't say a word. She didn't scream or sob. Her silence was more damning than any accusation. With a dignity that felt wrenched from the very depths of her soul, she turned and walked away. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of pity, shock, and morbid curiosity. As she walked out of the orchid ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of her life, Dominic stood frozen, his hand still tingling. He felt a momentary, hollow victory, the kind a bully feels after a conquest. Sloan slid her arm through his, her voice a triumphant purr. "She's finally gone. Now we can begin." Dominic nodded, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the empty doorway his wife had just disappeared through. He had won. He had asserted his dominance, but he didn't know. He didn't know that the slap was more than an act of cruelty. He didn't know that for his pregnant wife, a sudden, violent jolt of shock and adrenaline was not just a trauma, but a potential death sentence. He didn't know that Seraphina was keeping a secret far more profound than her pregnancy, a secret tucked away in the faulty, fragile chambers of her own heart. He didn't know that he hadn't just slapped his wife. He had just armed her with the one thing she never had before. The absolute, unwavering certainty that she had to save herself. The click of the heavy oak door shutting behind her was the sound of a chapter ending. Seraphina didn't hail a cab. She walked. The cold night air was a balm on her burning cheek, each step on the unforgiving pavement, a rhythm pulling her further from the woman she used to be. The city lights blurred into watercolor streaks through the unshed tears that now clouded her vision. Her hand never left her stomach. "I'm sorry," she thought. The words a silent prayer to her unborn child. "I'm so sorry I chose him. I won't make that mistake again." Her feet carried her on autopilot, not to the palatial, sterile penthouse she shared with Dominic, but to a quiet, tree-lined street in a different part of town. She stopped before a modest brownstone with a single light glowing in a second-floor window. This was her only sanctuary. She pressed the buzzer. A moment later, a warm voice, laced with concern, crackled through the speaker. "Seraphina, is that you? It's past midnight." "Mira, please," Seraphina whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I need you." The door buzzed open instantly. Seraphina climbed the stairs, her legs feeling like lead. Dr. Mira Sethi stood at the top, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her kind face etched with worry. She was wearing scrubs, having clearly just returned from a long shift. Mira wasn't just Seraphina's cardiologist. She was the sole keeper of her most terrifying secret. Mira saw the red mark on Seraphina's cheek, and her expression shifted from concern to a quiet, controlled fury. She didn't ask. She simply wrapped her arms around Seraphina, guiding her inside her cozy, book-filled apartment. "Sit," she said gently, leading Seraphina to a plush armchair. "I'll get you some water." As Mira moved to the kitchen, Seraphina's composure finally crumbled. Sobs racked her body, raw and agonizing. They were not just for the slap, but for the years of quiet erosion, the slow death of her spirit she had mistaken for marital compromise. Mira returned, not with water, but with a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope. She knelt before Seraphina, her touch professional and reassuring. "Breathe with me, Seraphina. Deep, slow breaths. That's it. Tell me what happened." Between gasps, Seraphina recounted the scene at the gala. The public humiliation, Sloan's triumph, the coldness in Dominic's eyes, and finally, the slap. Mira's jaw tightened as she listened, her eyes flashing with anger. She finished taking Seraphina's vitals, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Your pressure is dangerously high, and your heart rate, it's a chaotic rhythm. We call it arrhythmia. The shock could have triggered it." She looked Seraphina directly in the eye, her voice firm but gentle. "This is what I warned you about, Seraphina. Stress is your enemy. A shock like that, it's poison for your condition." The condition? The secret. Peripartum cardiomyopathy. It was a rare form of heart failure that occurred during the last month of pregnancy, or up to 5 months after giving birth. For Seraphina, the diagnosis had come early, a shadow lurking behind the joy of her pregnancy. Her heart muscle, weakened and enlarged, was struggling to handle the increased blood volume of carrying a child. Mira had been unequivocal. The pregnancy was high risk. She needed a serene, stress-free environment. Bed rest would likely be required in the 3rd trimester. A violent, emotional shock was the worst possible scenario. I was going to tell him. Seraphina wept, clutching Mira's hand. I thought the baby. I thought it would change things. That he would remember the man he was when we met. That man is gone, Seraphina, Mira said softly, but with unshakable conviction. Or maybe he was never really there. Narcissists are brilliant actors. Mira had been against her keeping the condition from Dominic. He's the father, she had argued weeks ago. He has a right to know the risk you're taking. But Seraphina had refused. Telling Dominic would mean giving him more power, another vulnerability to exploit. He would see it as a weakness, a flaw in his perfect life. He might have even pressured her to terminate, to remove the problem. This baby was hers, her risk, her hope. She would not let his darkness tarnish it. "What do we do now?" Seraphina asked, her voice small. "First, we stabilize you," Mira said, switching into doctor mode. "I want to monitor you for the next few hours. Then, we make a plan. You cannot go back to him. Not for a night. Do you understand me? This is no longer about your happiness. It's about your survival. And the survival of your baby." The word survival landed with grim finality. The fantasy was over. This was the reality. Her husband, the man she had promised to love in sickness and in health, was the sickness. Meanwhile, back in the penthouse, Dominic poured himself a second tumbler of Macallan 25. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving a sour, unsettling residue. The sprawling apartment, usually a testament to his success, felt cavernous and empty. Sloan was there, draped over a leather sofa, scrolling through her phone, but her presence was a sharp, grating note in the silence. "The board is going to love the press from the gala," she said, not looking up. "Pledged donations broke last year's record." Dominic didn't respond. He swirled the amber liquid, the image of Seraphina's face, shocked, betrayed, and then chillingly calm, seared into his mind. He had expected hysterics. The quiet dignity of her exit was more unnerving than any screaming match. "She'll come crawling back," Sloan said, sensing his mood. "They always do. She has nowhere to go. Everything she is, you gave her. You gave her." The words echoed in his head. He had given her a name, a lifestyle, a pedestal. But what had he taken away? He remembered the Seraphina he'd first met. She was an architectural historian, brilliant and passionate, her eyes lighting up when she talked about forgotten buildings. He had loved that light. But slowly, subtly, he had snuffed it out, demanding her world shrink to fit his. Her career became a hobby, then a memory. Her friends were replaced by the wives of his business associates. He pushed the thought away. It was a weakness. Sentimentality was a liability in his world. "Her lawyers will be in touch, I imagine," Dominic said, his voice hard. "Let them," Sloan scoffed. "Our prenup is ironclad. She gets her settlement, and we get our lives back." Dominic walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering city. He was the king of this skyline. He had crushed competitors, bent markets to his will, and fired people without a second thought. He was in control. So why did he feel a profound sense of loss? Why did the slap, an act of ultimate control, feel like he had just detonated a bomb in his own foundations? He had slapped his pregnant wife. He said the words to himself, testing their weight. They felt ugly, brutish, not the actions of a master of the universe, but of a common thug. He tried to justify it. She had provoked him. She had embarrassed him. She had tried to trap him. But the excuses felt thin, like cheap fabric stretched over a jagged hole. He didn't know that miles away, his wife was hooked up to an EKG machine in her doctor's apartment, her heart's erratic rhythm a frantic testament to his rage. He didn't know that the single, violent act was the catalyst not for her return, but for her disappearance. He had meant to put her in her place, but instead he had set her free. And in doing so, he had unknowingly lit the fuse on the immolation of his own carefully constructed world. 3 days passed. 3 days of absolute silence from Seraphina. It was a silence that grew louder with each passing hour, gnawing at the edges of a Dominic's composure. He expected a tearful phone call, a summons from a high-powered divorce attorney, a dramatic confrontation. He got nothing. Her closets were still full of designer clothes. Her car was in the garage. Her personal bank account, which he funded, was untouched. It was as if she had stepped out of the ballroom and simply evaporated. "She's playing a game," Sloan insisted over dinner at a chic minimalist restaurant. "She wants you to panic, to come looking for her, so she can set the terms." Dominic nodded, but he wasn't convinced. This wasn't Seraphina's style. Her methods were always direct, her emotions transparent. This quiet, vanishing act was unnervingly strategic. It was the move of a different woman. His frustration began to curdle into a strange, obsessive need to find her. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about control. She had defied him, slipped through his grasp, and his entire psyche was built on the premise that nothing and no one slipped through his grasp. He hired a private investigator, a discreet bulldog of a man named Marcus Thorne, who had previously done corporate espionage for him. "Find her," Dominic commanded, his voice clipped. "I want to know where she is, who she's with, what she's planning. I want to know what she had for breakfast. Total surveillance." "Understood, Mr. Wrenford," Thorne said, his face impassive. While Thorne's men began their hunt, Dominic tried to immerse himself in work. But the company, once his kingdom, now felt like a distraction. During a high-stakes negotiation over a new tech merger, he found his mind drifting. He pictured Seraphina's face. He replayed the slap in his mind, the sound of it echoing in the silent boardroom. For the first time, a sliver of genuine shame pierced his armor of arrogance. Sloan, meanwhile, was flourishing. With Seraphina gone, she seamlessly slid into the role of the woman by Dominic's side. She redecorated a guest room, her clothes appearing in the wardrobe. She advised him on business, her insights sharp and ruthless. She was the perfect partner for the man he was supposed to be. Yet her presence felt hollow. Her ambition, which had once seemed thrilling, now felt rapacious. "I've been reviewing the Henderson acquisition files," she said one evening, her laptop glowing in the dim light of the penthouse. "Their patent portfolio is undervalued. If we trigger a hostile takeover now, we could absorb them for pennies on the dollar." It was a brilliant, predatory move. The old Dominic would have relished it. The current Dominic just grunted in response, his mind elsewhere. He was thinking about Seraphina's favourite place, a small, dusty bookstore in the West Village she used to drag him to. He wondered if she was there. Thorne's first report came back a week later. It was a folder full of negatives. "She's a ghost, Mr. Wrenford," Thorne said over the phone. "No credit card activity. No phone usage. The device is off. Her known friends haven't seen her. Her family, that distant cousin in Oregon, hasn't heard from her. We've checked airports, train stations, car rentals. Nothing. It's like she walked into a black hole." "That's impossible," Dominic snapped. "She's not a spy. She's my wife. Find something." "There is one anomaly," Thorne said, his voice hesitant. "We ran a check on her medical records, just a routine background sweep. There's a flag. Her files are sealed, heavily encrypted, not just doctor-patient confidentiality. This is a digital fortress. It would take a court order or a top-tier hacker to get in." Dominic froze. Medical files? Seraphina was perfectly healthy. The occasional checkup, a flu shot. Why would her records be sealed? "What kind of doctor?" Dominic demanded. "A cardiologist," Thorne replied. "Dr. Mira Sethi, top of her field at New York Presbyterian." Cardiologist. The word made no sense. Seraphina had no heart condition. Or did she? He mentally scrolled through their years together. Had there been signs he'd missed? Moments of fatigue he'd dismissed as laziness? Shortness of breath he'd attributed to a lack of fitness? A cold wave of unease washed over him. Seraphina, meanwhile, was miles away, tucked into a small, rented cottage on the coast of Maine, arranged by Mira through a network of doctors who specialized in helping patients escape abusive situations. The air smelled of salt and pine, a clean, sharp scent that was the antithesis of the cloying lilies in the orchid ballroom. The cottage was simple, furnished with mismatched but comfortable furniture. For the first week, she had done nothing but sleep, the deep, exhausted sleep of a soldier coming off the line. Mira called twice a day, monitoring her symptoms remotely through a medical-grade smartwatch that tracked her heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. Slowly, Seraphina began to heal. The red mark on her cheek faded, but the internal shift was permanent. The fear was still there, a constant low hum, but it was now overlaid with a steely resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was a mother, protecting her child. She began to document everything. She wrote down every instance of Dominic's emotional abuse, his controlling behavior, his gaslighting. She detailed his financial dealings, the off-the-books consulting fees he'd bragged about, the ruthless tactics he'd used to crush smaller companies. She had been a silent witness to his empire building, and she had absorbed more than he ever realized. The architectural historian's mind, trained to see the structural integrity or weakness in buildings, now saw the cracks in Dominic's corporate facade. She was not building a case for a larger settlement. She was building a lifeboat, a way to ensure that Dominic could never touch her or her child again. "Are you sure you want to do this, Seraphina?" Mira asked during one of their calls. "Poking the bear could be dangerous." "He left me no choice, Mira," Seraphina replied, her voice steady. She looked out the window at the grey, churning ocean. "He thinks I'm a ghost, but a ghost can still haunt." Back in New York, Dominic was becoming a hunter, obsessed with his prey. He sat in his car outside Dr. Mira Sethi's brownstone, a place Thorne's report had flagged as her residence. He watched for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, he saw Dr. Sethi leave, getting into a taxi. On impulse, he followed. The taxi led him to a high-end pharmacy. He watched as the doctor went inside and came out with a small paper bag. It was nothing, and yet it felt like something. What medication would a cardiologist pick up for a ghost? His obsession was now a full-blown inferno. He needed to know what was in those sealed files. He needed to understand the secret Seraphina was keeping. The power in their relationship had always been his. Her sudden autonomy, her complete disappearance, felt like a fundamental law of his universe had been broken. He had no idea that in his desperate hunt to reclaim his power, he was about to uncover a truth that would strip him of every last vestige of it. Dominic's obsession with the sealed medical files became the single focal point of his existence. The Henderson acquisition, once a thrilling corporate conquest, now felt like a tedious chore. He delegated more and more to Sloan, whose ambition happily filled the vacuum he created. She saw his distraction as a byproduct of the messy divorce, a temporary weakness she could exploit for her own advancement. She had no idea it was the beginning of his unraveling. Dominic, a man who believed money could solve any problem, decided to bypass legal channels. Through Thorne, he hired a hacker, a shadowy figure known only as Nix. The price was exorbitant, the ethics non-existent. Dominic didn't care. "I want to know what's in Dr. Sethi's file on Seraphina Vale," Dominic instructed Thorne. "Every test result, every diagnosis, every note." 2 days later, Thorne called. His voice was different, stripped of its usual professional detachment. It was hesitant, almost somber. "We have it. The file is open. I think you need to see this for yourself, Mr. Wrenford. I'm sending a courier." An hour later, a slim, encrypted tablet was delivered to Dominic's private office. He locked the door, his heart hammering in a way he wasn't used to. He opened the file. The screen was filled with medical terminology he didn't understand. Ejection fraction, LV dysfunction, cardiomegaly. But then he started reading Dr. Sethi's clinical notes, and the world tilted on its axis. Patient, Seraphina Vale. Diagnosis, peripartum cardiomyopathy, PPCM. Condition discovered at 19 weeks gestation. Severe weakening of the heart muscle. Patient's ejection fraction is at a critical 30%. He scrolled down, his breathing growing shallow. The patient is at extremely high risk for fatal arrhythmia, blood clots, and progressive heart failure, exacerbated by the physiological stress of the pregnancy. Any significant emotional or physical shock could trigger a catastrophic cardiac event. Stress reduction is not a recommendation, it is a clinical necessity for survival. Shock. The word screamed at him from the screen. He saw the orchid ballroom. He heard the gunshot crack of his hand against her cheek. He saw her head snap to the side. A catastrophic cardiac event. He kept reading, his hands trembling. Patient has been repeatedly advised of the grave risks of continuing the pregnancy. She has refused termination, expressing a profound desire for this child. Patient also refused to inform her husband, Mr. Dominic Wrenford, citing concerns over his potential reaction, fearing emotional coercion and a lack of support. She believes the stress of his reaction would be more detrimental than keeping the secret. The final sentences hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't kept the secret to deceive him. She had kept it to protect herself. And the baby, from him. His cruelty wasn't just a character flaw, it was a quantifiable medical risk. The air was punched from his lungs. He felt a wave of nausea so intense he had to grip his desk to keep from falling. The slap. Oh God, the slap. It wasn't just an act of humiliation in front of his mistress. It was a potential murder weapon. He had stood there, puffed up with his own pathetic ego, while his wife, his fragile, sick wife, who was risking her life to carry his child, absorbed a blow that could have stopped her heart. The shame was a physical entity, a black viscous liquid filling his chest, choking him. The image of Seraphina's calm, clear eyes as she walked away was recontextualized. It wasn't dignity in the face of insult. It was the terrifying calm of someone who had just survived a near-death experience. He was still staring at the screen, his world reduced to medical text, when the door to his office burst open. It was Sloan, her face flushed with a strange, manic energy he'd never seen before. "Dominic, you need to see this," she said, her voice high and triumphant. She wasn't asking for permission. "Get out," he rasped, trying to shield the tablet. "No, you don't understand." She strode to his desk, throwing a stack of papers down. "It's done. The board just voted. The motion passed." "What motion?" Dominic asked, his mind a fog of medical dread. "The motion to remove you as CEO, effective immediately," she said, a cruel, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "On the grounds of gross negligence and erratic behavior. Your distraction over your little domestic drama has been very, very useful." Dominic stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about? I control the board." "Not anymore," Sloan said, her voice dropping, losing its purr and gaining a razor's edge. "For the last 2 years, I have been acquiring shares through shell corporations. I've been making alliances. The Henderson deal you handed me, the final piece. Their block of shares, combined with mine and our new allies, gives me a controlling interest." It was impossible. A corporate coup of this magnitude. It was unthinkable. "Why?" he managed to ask, the word barely a whisper. "I gave you everything." Sloane's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a grief so old and so cold it chilled the room. "You didn't give me anything, Dominic. You took everything from my sister." "Your sister?" "Amelia Whitmore," Sloan said, her voice trembling with repressed fury. "Does that name mean anything to you? Or was she just another beautiful thing you acquired and then discarded when she became inconvenient?" Amelia. The name hit him like a ghost from a past he had buried deep. His college girlfriend. Fiery, passionate Amelia, who had died in a car crash. A crash that had happened after he had broken up with her, callously and coldly, because her emotional intensity was becoming too much for his budding ambitions. "Amelia, she was your sister," Dominic whispered, the second revelation of the day completing his demolition. "My big sister," Sloan bit out, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She worshipped you, and you broke her. The night she died, she called me from her car, sobbing, hysterical, because you had dumped her. She was distracted, heartbroken. You think that slap was bad? You should have heard what you did to her spirit. You killed her just as surely as if you had been driving the car. Everything clicked into place. Her ambition, her ruthlessness, her calculated seduction. It was never about love or money. It was about revenge. A long, patient, meticulous revenge plot to dismantle his life, piece by piece, just as he had dismantled her sister's. "I've wanted this for 10 years, Dominic," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. "To see you with nothing. To see the look on your face when the empire you built on the bones of other people crumbles. You slapped your pregnant wife in public? Perfect. A beautiful, self-inflicted wound to cap it all off." She leaned over the desk, her face close to his. "Your company is mine. Your reputation is in ruins. And your wife, the one carrying your heir, the one you almost killed. She's gone. You have nothing." Sloan stood up straight, all traces of emotion gone, replaced by the cold mask of a CEO. "Security will escort you out. Your personal effects will be sent to your home. Goodbye, Dominic." She turned and walked out, leaving him in the silent, opulent office that was no longer his. He was surrounded by the trappings of power, but he had never been more powerless. He looked at the tablet in his hands, at the clinical diagnosis of Seraphina's broken heart, and then at the papers on his desk, the clinical execution of his corporate life. He hadn't just lost his company. He hadn't just been played by the ghost of a past sin. He had discovered that he was the villain in every story, a monster of his own making. And the woman he had brutalized wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor of a war he never even knew she was fighting. He had hit rock bottom, only to find that the floor was a trap door leading to an even deeper darkness. The days that followed were a descent into a grey, soundless hell. Dominic found himself a prisoner in the penthouse, a glass castle that now felt like a mausoleum for the man he used to be. The news of his ousting was a brutal public spectacle. News headlines screamed his downfall. Wrenford forced out in shocking takeover, from titan to pariah, CEO's mistress revealed as mastermind. His name, once a synonym for power, was now a punchline. His phone, once a relentless torrent of calls from the most powerful people in the country, was silent. His business associates, the ones who had laughed at his jokes and accepted his largesse, now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a leper. But the public humiliation was a dull ache compared to the sharp, stabbing agony of the truth about Seraphina. The tablet with her medical file became a sacred, terrible text. He read it over and over, the words branding themselves onto his soul. High risk, catastrophic cardiac event. She refused to inform her husband, fearing his reaction. He was the risk factor. He was the disease. The ghost of Amelia Whitmore, summoned by Sloan's revelation, now shared the penthouse with him. He remembered her raw, unedited love and his youthful terror of it. He had crushed her spirit with the same casual cruelty he had later perfected on Seraphina. He saw now that his entire life had been a frantic, ruthless effort to build walls around his own heart, to control everything and everyone, so he would never have to feel that vulnerable again. In the end, his walls hadn't protected him. They had only ensured he would be alone when they inevitably crumbled. He drank. At first, it was the expensive scotch, but when that ran out, he moved to cheaper whiskey. The burn in his throat, a welcome distraction from the burn in his soul. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just sat in the dark, watching the city lights, the kingdom he had lost. One night, shattered and drunk, he found himself in Seraphina's walk-in closet. Her scent, a faint, clean smell of lavender and vanilla, still lingered. He ran his hand over a soft cashmere sweater and collapsed onto the floor, the first sober, genuine tears of his adult life tracking paths through the stubble on his face. He wasn't crying for his lost company or his shattered reputation. He was crying for the good man he might have been. He was crying for the gentle, brilliant woman he had systematically broken. He was crying for his unborn child, who was growing inside a mother whose life he had endangered. A child he would likely never know. This was his rock bottom, a place of absolute desolation. And it was here, in the suffocating darkness of his wife's empty closet, that the first glimmer of something other than self-pity sparked. It wasn't hope. It was a terrifying, humbling sense of responsibility. Penance. He stopped drinking. He took a shower. He looked at his haggard face in the mirror and saw the monster Sloan had described. He had to do something. Not to win Seraphina back. He knew with bone-deep certainty that he had forfeited that right forever. Not to fix things, because some things, once shattered, could never be made whole. He had to do something, because it was the only way to prove to himself that a fragment of a decent man still existed somewhere inside the wreckage. In the salty air of the Maine coast, Seraphina was entering her third trimester. Her belly was round and full, a constant, reassuring presence. Life had found a quiet rhythm. Mornings were for walks on the rocky beach, afternoons for her research into Dominic's corporate web, and evenings for reading to her baby, her voice soft and steady. Mira had arranged for a local OB-GYN and a cardiologist to take over her care. The reports were sent back to Mira daily. Seraphina's condition was stable, but the final weeks were the most perilous. The strain on her heart was immense. Bed rest was now mandatory. She had followed the news of Dominic's downfall with a strange sense of detachment. She saw Sloan's vengeance for what it was, a tragedy born of another tragedy. It brought Seraphina no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for all the lives broken by one man's fear of love. Her legal team, funded by a small trust her parents had left her, had quietly filed for divorce. They were building a case to ensure her and her child's financial independence, using the information she had painstakingly compiled. She was no longer Dominic Wrenford, the appendage. She was Seraphina Vale, a mother and a survivor, fighting for her future. She rarely thought of Dominic the man anymore. She thought of him as a force, a storm she had weathered. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the baby kicked, she would feel a pang of sorrow. Her child would never know the fantasy she'd once had. A loving father, a happy home. She mourned the dream, even as she fought for the reality. One afternoon, a package arrived. It was from an anonymous sender, postmarked from New York. Wary, she had her lawyer's contact vet it before she opened it. Inside was a single document. It was a deed. The document transferred sole, unencumbered ownership of a historic brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, a building she had once told Dominic was her favorite in all of New York, a place she had dreamed of restoring to her. A separate bank statement showed a multi-million-dollar trust fund had been established, with her unborn child as the sole beneficiary. The fund was irrevocable. There was no note, no explanation. But Seraphina knew. It wasn't a gift to win her back. It was an apology, an act of penance made in silence. It was the first thing Dominic had done in years that wasn't about control, but about letting go. She held the deed, her fingers tracing the legal language. It didn't change anything between them. The wound was too deep. But it was a signal, a sign that the monster who had slapped her in the ballroom was perhaps finally confronting himself in the ruins of his life. For the first time, she allowed herself a sliver of hope, not for him or for them, but for the possibility that her child's father might one day become a man she would not have to be ashamed of. The first contraction was a sharp, tightening wave that stole Seraphina's breath. It was 3 a.m. The world outside her cottage window was a canvas of deep indigo and silver starlight. Her heart, a weary soldier, immediately began to hammer an erratic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. The final, most dangerous battle. Mira had a protocol in place. The local medical team was alerted. An ambulance, lights off to avoid panic, arrived within minutes. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, Seraphina's hand instinctively went to her belly. "Stay with me," she whispered to her baby. "We're almost there." The birth was a harrowing, delicate dance between obstetrics and cardiology. The delivery room was a hushed, tense theatre of beeping machines and focused professionals. Seraphina's cardiologist stood beside her obstetrician, their eyes constantly flicking between Seraphina and the monitors, displaying her heart's frantic, struggling protest. Seraphina fought. She pushed through waves of pain, focusing on Mira's voice, which cut through the fog, guiding her, encouraging her. She was fighting not just the physical agony of a childbirth, but the terror of her own fragile body. Every ounce of her will was focused on one single outcome: bringing her child into the world safely. And then, after hours that felt like a lifetime, a new sound filled the room. A powerful, healthy cry. "It's a girl, Seraphina," the obstetrician announced, his voice thick with relief. "She's beautiful." They laid the tiny, squirming baby on Seraphina's chest. A wave of love so fierce and overwhelming it eclipsed everything else. The pain, the fear, the memory of Dominic washed over her. She looked at her daughter's perfect, wrinkled face and wept, tears of exhaustion, relief, and pure, unadulterated joy. She had done it. They had survived. She named her hope. Miles away, Dominic knew nothing of the drama unfolding in a Maine hospital. He had spent the last 2 months systematically dismantling his old life. He sold the penthouse, the cars, the watches. He put the money, every last cent that Sloan's corporate coup hadn't tied up, into the trust for his child. He kept only enough to live a simple, anonymous life. His penance was not just financial, it was personal. He sought out a therapist, a gruff, no-nonsense man who forced him to confront the deep-seated fears that had fueled his narcissism. He started volunteering at a soup kitchen, the act of serving others a humbling, alien experience. He was learning to live without the armor of wealth and power, and for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of an authentic self. He had one last desperate act of atonement to perform. Through a series of discreet inquiries, he found out about Seraphina's high-risk delivery. Consumed by a terror he now understood, he used the last of his influence not for himself, but for her. He contacted the world's leading neonatal cardiac specialist, a doctor in Zurich, and paid an astronomical, anonymous fee to have him on standby, ready to fly to Maine on a private jet at a moment's notice, just in case the baby inherited any cardiac weakness. It was a prayer whispered into the void, a desperate, selfless act from a man who knew he had no right to even ask for a miracle. 6 months later, the Brooklyn Heights brownstone was no longer a dream. It was a home. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of sawdust and fresh paint had replaced the smell of decay. Seraphina, with baby hope strapped to her chest, directed a team of restoration experts, her passion for architecture rekindled, her voice confident and clear. Her heart had stabilized after the delivery. The strain lifted. Mahara called it a miracle of medicine and maternal will. Seraphina was still on medication, still monitored, but she was alive and thriving. She was a mother, a business owner overseeing the restoration, a woman reborn from the ashes of her old life. One crisp autumn afternoon, as she sat on a bench in the park across the street, gently rocking Hope's stroller, she saw him. Dominic stood at the edge of the park, looking not at her, but at the brownstone. He was a different man. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple jeans and a worn jacket. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. He looked thinner, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, even from a distance, held a clarity she'd never seen. He saw her watching and hesitated, as if ready to bolt. Then, taking a deep breath, he walked towards her, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. "Seraphina," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its commanding tone. "Dominic." She kept her own voice neutral, her hand resting protectively on the stroller. "The house, it looks beautiful," he said, his gaze returning to the building. "You're bringing it back to life." The metaphor hung in the air between them. "That was the plan," she said simply. An awkward silence fell, filled only by the rustling of leaves and the distant city sounds. "I know you don't want to hear from me," he began, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were filled with a profound, desolate sorrow. "And I know an apology is an insult for what I did. It's a word, and I dealt in actions. But I am sorry, Seraphina, for the slap, for the years of cruelty, for being a coward who was so afraid of his own heart that he tried to break yours. I'm sorry I endangered you. And her." He glanced at the stroller, his voice cracking. He took a step back, as if to prove he wasn't a threat. "I don't want anything. I don't ask for forgiveness. I forfeited that. I wanted to see, for myself, that you were both okay. And I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be a man who is worthy of being her father, even if it's just on a piece of paper." Seraphina looked at him, at this broken, rebuilt man. The rage she had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber understanding. She thought of the anonymous doctor, a fact her lawyer had uncovered and shared with her weeks ago. She thought of the house, the trust, actions. She would never be his wife again. The trust, the intimacy, the love that was shattered beyond repair. But her daughter deserved more than a monster for a father. She deserved the man who was standing before her now, the one who had clawed his way out of the darkness. "She has your eyes," Seraphina said softly. Dominic's breath hitched. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he didn't bother to wipe it away. "Once a month," Seraphina said, her voice firm, setting a boundary. "We can meet here, in the park. You can see her. We'll see how it goes." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reunion. It was a beginning. A fragile, tentative, and realistic new beginning, built not on a grand romance, but on the hard-won ashes of betrayal and the quiet, demanding promise of redemption. Seraphina turned the stroller and walked toward her new home. A free woman, a strong mother, leaving Dominic in the autumn sunlight to take his first step on the long, slow road back to humanity. The journey from a gilded cage to a life of authentic freedom is never easy. Seraphina's story is a powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest souls. She didn't just survive. She rediscovered her purpose, her strength, and her voice. Dominic, stripped of everything, was forced to confront the monster within and begin the arduous process of becoming a man. Their story isn't about a fairy tale ending, but about the gritty, painful, and ultimately hopeful reality of redemption and new beginnings. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes hitting rock bottom is the only way to find solid ground.